Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us. I'm Musab Al-Karim from Nilan University in Sudan. I'm the organizer of SONA webinar series, which is organized by the Society of Neuroscientists in Africa and trained in Africa in collaboration with African Academy of Neurology and IBDGC Africa. This webinar series is also part of Worldwide Neuro initiative. Today, we are very pleased to host a panel discussion about the situation of neuroscience in Africa. Basically, we will have around 30 minutes talk by one of our rising stars, Dr. Mahmoud Bokar Mena. That will be followed by a panel discussion with our distinguished panelists. So let me quickly introduce our speaker. As I mentioned, our main speaker is Mahmoud Bokar Mena, who is a research fellow in the Cerebral Lab at the University of Sussex. He is the outreach coordinator for Trend in Africa and founder of Science Communication Hub Nigeria, and also founder of African Science Literacy Network. For about a decade now, Mahmoud has been heavily involved with the promotion of neuroscience in Africa through outreach activities, organizing training workshops, and recently through research on African neuroscience. Our first panelist is Pauline Issa. Pauline is passionate about using research, innovation, and collaboration to advance health in society. She is a senior manager for global health at the National Institute for Health Research in the UK. Prior to NIHR, she was instrumental in establishing and managing the Cambridge Africa program at the University of Cambridge. Pauline is also a trustee of Trend in Africa. So our second panelist is Raliza Stoyanova. Raliza is a science portfolio manager at the Wellcome Trust. Her academic background includes behavioral and functional neuroimaging research in healthy volunteers and clinical populations. Her role at Wellcome Trust is to oversee the development of the cognitive neuroscience and mental health research. We will be also joined by a third panelist, who is Thomas Tagu. Thomas is a neuroscientist, science communicator, and co-founder of GH Scientific, an organization focused on building capacity in STEM through public engagement activities. He is currently based at the University of Ghana. Thomas holds executive positioning in the Ghana Science Association and the Ghana Neuroscience Society, and sits on the IBRO African Regional Committee. Before we get started, I just would like to remind our audience that this webinar is designed to be interactive, and they can ask as many questions as they want by simply typing their questions and comment in the Q&A box at the bottom of this screen, and our speaker and distinguished panelist will reply at the end of this panel discussion. So now I want to turn it over to Mahmoud.
Oh, thank you, Musab. Let me share my screen now. Okay. Okay, let's see. Is it working all right?
Yeah, we can see very clearly.
All right, thank you. All right, thank you very much, Musab, for the introduction. And it's kind of weird because I used to introduce other people in this webinar series. So it's kind of weird to get introduced by you today. But yeah, so I'm really excited that I'll be sharing our latest data on African neuroscience. And it's my hope that this will generate conversation about the state of neuroscience within the continent. And hopefully it will shape funding decisions as well to strengthen the research in this field in the continent. But I'll start by giving you some boring statistics about Africa. So of course, most of you will be aware that Africa currently holds about 15% of the global population. And this is expected to rise up to 25% in 2050. And the worrying thing about this is that about 25% of global burden of diseases also is in Africa. And since we are talking about neuroscience, if you look at the kind of burden of neurological disorders, it's also very high in Africa. And we're talking about stroke, headache, meningitis, etc. So given the kind of high population of Africa and this burden of diseases in the continent, one would imagine that the output, especially our scientific outputs coming from the continent, would be very high. But unfortunately, Africa contributes less than 2% of kind of scientific research. And if you look at it in terms of content generation generally, even in terms of collaborative coding and domain registration, only few come from Africa. And we kind of know that, you know, in terms of landmass, Africa, you know, is kind of bigger than USA, China, as well as Europe combined. But if you look at this map, of course, it's a little bit old, but if you look at it, it tells you how bad the situation is, because Africa is quite shrunk there. Even the United States is much bigger than this continent that is much bigger than the United States. So this is quite worrying. And I think this disparity is even more in the field of neuroscience. So for example, this is data published by Elsevier based on global output in neuroscience from 2009 to 2013. And in this data, they clearly show that the 41 EU countries produce more neuroscience publications followed by the United States, etc. But what is really worrying is that there is no country in Africa that featured in this kind of analysis. And of course, in this paper, they also said that the sheer complexity of the human brain means that accelerating discovery in neuroscience will require global integration of effort, data, and analysis. And despite the kind of, in terms of population, Africa is huge and landmass, but at the same time, there's a huge genetic diversity in Africa, but yet our representation in the global neuroscience is completely insignificant. So as someone who was trained in Nigeria before moving to the UK, obviously, I think this is something that I thought is really important to address. But also because as a member of Train in Africa, Train, as some of you will know, is an NGO promoting science in Africa, but especially neuroscience. Being part of that also enabled me to see some of the problems and have a discussion with other people in the community. And we all thought that it's important to really understand the situation about neuroscience in the continent. So for example, what is the state of neuroscience research in Africa? Where is it being done? What areas are being prioritized? Which model systems and techniques are being used? Who is funding African neuroscience research? I think this is really important simply because, you know, the continent is huge and different regions have different problems. I could remember doing my undergraduate research, I funded my undergraduate research, and a lot of people also fund their research, you know, in Africa. So of course, it's really important to understand these different things happening so that we will know the problems and hopefully find out how to fix them. But the problem is we don't have such data about African neuroscience. But of course, if you go online to, you know, check, you will see a few publications about Africa, neuroscience in Africa. So for example, this was a paper published in 2016 talking about African neuroscience, and the data was collected based on database mining, Web of Science, PubMed, etc. And they collected this information, put it together, and they said that these are the 10 top countries actively doing neuroscience research within Africa. But the problem is, are all these publications driven by African labs? And I think this is really an important question, because we are talking about you know, global representation of neuroscience, African neuroscience. And to address that, we really need to understand what contribution is coming from African laboratories. And as someone who was trained in Nigeria before coming to do my research here in the UK, oftentimes when you publish an article, you also put your affiliation, your African affiliation in that article. So a lot of times such database mining approaches end up giving us data about neuroscience or research within the continent, which in reality were not done within the African lab or were not driven by African researchers. So we really thought that it's important to have a real data that addresses that. And in the last 4 years, we started addressing this. Last year, we published this paper on our Nigerian neuroscience. And recently, we uploaded this paper on the neuroscience in the 54 continent, in the 54 countries within Africa. And I think I'll be sharing most of the data from this, but I'll also be sharing some data from the Nigerian neuroscience publication. But in a nutshell, what is our approach? So basically, we know that we can never cover the whole publications within Africa. All we need is a sample that will tell us about the situation in the continent. So we kind of use PubMed, obviously, due to its leading role in kind of indexing publications in biomedical sciences. We looked at the data from 1996 to 2017, over 21 years. We retrieved the neuroscience publications from the continent, which gave us about 12,326 articles. But at the same time, because we wanted to make a global comparison, we collected articles, 10 articles each from each year, from the USA, UK, Japan, and Australia, which we decided to term global not, but of course also from Brazil, which is somehow just behind the global not. But what is really important about our data or about approach is that after collecting this data, we sort this data, remove duplicates and irrelevant articles. Then we extract these papers to look at them and see whether they've been kind of driven by African laboratories or not. And so basically we had to, read the whole paper, look at the affiliations, materials and methods, acknowledgements to find out whether the research was actually done in African laboratory. And then after that, we took out some, we scored the papers based on different criteria. And as you can see, about 58% of the papers that we retrieved were completely discarded after this sorting. We're leaving us with about 42% as the real papers coming from African laboratories. So this is really, really important because now we have a data set that we will go into to find out really about the situation about neuroscience in Africa. So the first question obviously was that, what is the research landscape in the continent? And as you can see, all the different regions within Africa are producing publications quite steadily, and these publications are increasing, which is quite encouraging. But particularly North Africa, obviously driven by Egypt, appear to be doing much more. They are producing more papers, and of course, Southern Africa, kind of led by South Africa, also is topping, and then in West Africa, Nigeria. But because neuroscience obviously is quite diverse, we've got basic, clinical, neuroscience. So we really wanted to capture all these different information. So, and as you can see, even in the clinical and basic neuroscience, there is still this increase. And to some extent, basic neuroscience appears to be a little bit higher. There is a little bit more research done in this area than in clinical neuroscience. But given this different regional kind of heterogeneity within Africa, we wanted to now see whether there is any socioeconomic determinant that could tell us how these different regions are doing in terms of the outputs that we saw. So as you can see from this data, there is a strong correlation between the outputs from countries and the GDP, as expected, obviously, R&D spending as well as population. And obviously, if a country is corrupt, that can be very bad for the outputs that their scientists produce. So this is quite kind of clear. And in a nutshell, this first bit tells us that Africa's neuroscience is on a steady rise, but a combination of money and manpower is crucial requirement for this trend to continue. But you know, seeing the two different things within the continent, which means that I was trained in Nigeria before coming to UK for my research. I was also, we were also interested in understanding the different neuroscience sub-disciplines that are being researched actively within the continent. So for this, we used the structure of neuroscience that was produced recently by Karandini. And I think they used the itineraries from the SFN meeting to structure the different sub-disciplines of neuroscience. And what we then did was to put our data into the same structure to see which areas are more actively being researched than the other areas. So this obviously is a very noisy slide, but in a nutshell, what I would like you to do is just look at this arrow. It shows you the blue balloon is for neurodegeneration and injury, and almost all African countries have big balloons, which means that this area is actively being researched within the continent. And of course, this area includes areas like cerebral malaria, meningitis, you know, depression, etc. But what is really even important to say is that in terms of publications, over 30% of publications from Africa are in this field, as compared to just above 20% from outside Africa. So what this really tells us is that neurodegeneration and injury is a dominant research theme in African neuroscience. So again, I like to keep referring myself as, because I was trained in Nigeria, so I like to keep going back to my experience back in Nigeria. I know that as an African, many countries in Africa are rich in traditional knowledge, especially knowledge associated with indigenous and medicinal plants. And I also know that a lot of researchers do work on medicinal plants, trying to find out whether they do have some therapeutic values. So and in fact, there are publications showing that many metabolites were discovered from African medicinal plants. So this is really an interesting area of research if we can properly do the research in the right manner. So in a nutshell, what we decided to do next is to look at what is happening in this area. So I like to call it the search for the elusive elixir. Yeah. So basically what we did is to now look at in the Africa, which countries are using medicinal plants in their neuroscience research. As you can see, some countries are doing more than others, but perhaps use this, it is probably more informative. You can see that there are 3 countries that stand out: Cameroon, Nigeria, and Ghana, all in West Africa. So the publications in Cameroon, about 30% are all using medicinal plants, and Nigeria, but of course, even Egypt, South Africa do use medicinal plants to some extent, but you know, not that much compared to these countries in West Africa. And if you look at the global north, you see that only Australia does have some papers in this area. But what is really interesting about this data is that when we looked at it, over 90% of these papers reported that the medicinal plants were indeed successful in doing what they were set out to do. So it's quite interesting, but we didn't wanted to look deeply at this data. And for this, we looked at Nigerian neuroscience. So for Nigerian neuroscience, we looked at which area of neuroscience are using this medicinal plants. So we found that about 42% of basic neuroscience research use medicinal plants and 0 in the clinical neuroscience. And most of these papers are looking at whether the medicinal plants have antioxidant property, sedative, or even analgesic property. And of course, over 80% said that they were effective. And the fact that nothing is happening in the clinical level, I thought that maybe this indicates that there is little collaboration between basic and clinical scientists. But of course, this is just a speculation at this stage. So in a nutshell, this also tells us that many African neuroscientists, especially in West Africa, heavily invest in the use of medicinal plants to find treatment for neurological disorders. So of course, one of the things that we really wanted to find out is what techniques and model systems are being used in African neuroscience. And of course, this is really important because it will tell us more about how we can improve it, especially in terms of infrastructure. So for this, we categorize techniques into advanced or standard techniques. And for advanced techniques, these are mostly like PCR, qPCR, Western blotting, like fluorescence and electron microscope, etc. So anything on that category, we call it advanced techniques. So based on this data, we now extracted data from all these different publications. And you can see, starting with, let's say, the advanced techniques, there are a few countries having strong use of advanced techniques, especially South Africa. But perhaps let's look at this from here. If you look at it, South Africa and Egypt are both using advanced techniques in their research much more than other countries. And Gambia is really, really interesting because you can see that Gambia really stands out. And it turns out that most of the publications in Gambia with this, using these techniques are those linked to the MRC funded unit. So which to some extent, relates to where the funding is coming from. But I'll talk about that much more later on. And if you look at Global North, obviously these techniques are widely used, and Brazil also, these techniques are being widely used. And then, but we wanted to also find out, what about transgenic models? Are transgenic models being utilized in African neuroscience? And here, the data is even more, I think, worrying, because you can see that very few, if any, African countries use transgenic models. To some extent, Egypt and South Africa, but that's really, really low compared to what you find in the Global North, but at the same time, what you find in Brazil. But again, we wanted to look deeper into this. So we again used Nigerian neuroscience as a model. And for this, we looked at the different model systems that have been used over the last 21 years. And what you see is that wild-type rat, mouse, also wild-type, or humans. So everything here that you see are wild-type. So they are the predominant models. And there was zero fruit fly zebrafish or C. elegans. But of course, from 2018, I think we started seeing some papers being published from Nigeria using fruit fly. But in nutshell, I think it's still very worrying, because these are the models that are affordable and cheap, and which are also genetically tractable. So, this perhaps potentially shows an area in which we could invest more. So in nutshell, this also tells us that the lack of access to cutting-edge equipment and transgenic model systems for basic neuroscience in Africa is worrying. And of course, it's an area that we can all, interventions can focus on. Now, after this, we wanted to also look at the visibility of African neuroscience. So here, what we did was to look at two key metrics: journal impact factor and citations. But of course, we all agree that journal impact factor is not really a nice metric to use due to the controversy around it, but we just wanted to use something that will give us an idea of what's happening. So starting from the Global North, what you see is most publications, of course, are from the 2 to 8 to 6 range, and there is a significant amount of publication in the 10+ impact factor journals. And this turns out to yield a significant citation in the 100+. And if you look at Brazil, you will see that it's not as much as the Global North, but it's also doing great. And if you look at Brazil and South Africa, there seems to be some similarity, especially in terms of the citation. More like the shape are similar, more like saying that these two countries are at the same stage of neuroscience development. But of course, in terms of the journal impact factor, you don't really see that much. But I would like to say that I like the citation even more, because it tells you more about what is really happening. But what is really happening here is that if you look at West Africa, in terms of impact factor, as well as the citations, we don't really have those in the top category. So, but if you look at North Africa, you see that not as much as Southern Africa, but much more than West Africa. So in a nutshell, I think in terms of this, what this data tells us is that Africa's neuroscience research visibility is growing, but different regions represent different stepping stones along this journey. And clearly West Africa seems to be lagging behind. So after this, we also wanted to look at collaborations. What is happening in terms of collaborations? Because obviously we know that collaborations influence research outputs. So for this, we analyze all the data, and here in pink, these are papers from countries based on collaboration, and this is based on no collaboration. And clearly you could see, based on these two different graphs, that citations are significantly more in papers that have collaboration, and also the publication, there is high tendency of being published in a journal with high impact factor when there is collaboration. So this is really, really exciting, and I think it's something that African neuroscientists can kind of do more about to kind of improve what is happening there. But in terms of who is collaborating with who, if you look at this metrics, basically here you see the study lead, and one thing is clear. For example, taking South Africa as an example, you can see that South African papers, they have collaborations with the global north. So here, Europe, North America, not much with Middle East, but to some extent Asia and Australia. Depending on which screen you use, maybe this might not really become much clearer. And if you look at Central Africa, East Africa, West Africa, all of them seem to be collaborating to some extent with South Africa, but not much of South African papers is, in fact, you don't really see much collaborations the other way around. And if you look at this data from, using this, you could see that there is a lot of collaboration going down to South Africa, and little of that is going towards the other regions. So it turns out that to some extent, and we know that in Africa, we usually used to say that South Africa is more like the Europe of Africa. So most other African countries like to collaborate with South Africa, and but South Africa doesn't seem, based on the data, to collaborate backwards, but they collaborate more with global north. And this is actually Tom's idea, and Tom wanted to actually see whether the data based on flights, within Africa can also tell us, it's kind of similar to the collaborations data, and you can clearly see that Europe, there's a lot of similarity in terms of this data. But of course, this is something quite exciting that Tom wanted to do, and I think it does tell us that there is some bit of relationship there. But anyway, in a nutshell, I think what this data is telling us is that collaborations are key for African neuroscience visibility. However, African neuroscientists rarely collaborated across long distance within Africa, and instead collaborations were mostly formed with scientists beyond the borders of the continent. So clearly, this is an area that that African neuroscientists can work on to enhance collaboration within the region. So finally, we wanted to look at who is funding who. Like I mentioned, I did funded my undergraduate research, and a lot of people are funding their research. So it's really important to find out who is funding who in Africa. And here, what we wanted to do, obviously, we had a lot of data. So we wanted to have an idea of what's happening. So we took all papers published in journals about 5 and impact factor 5, and then we looked into the acknowledgement to see what is happening. And what you find is that a lot of countries, a lot of the regions don't really declare their funding, especially North Africa, of course, West Africa as well, compared to the global north, as well as Brazil. And if you look at the funding, you see that for North Africa, West Africa, as well as Central Africa, most of the funding is international rather than domestic. Southern Africa is the only region where the domestic funding is higher than the international funding. And because Southern Africa is dominated by South Africa, I would say that this data is kind of reflecting the data from South Africa. But if you look at the countries outside Africa, all of these countries have one thing in common. Domestic funding is much, much more higher than local funding, the international funding. And I think this tells us that to have a viable neuroscience environment or scientific research environment, you really need domestic funding, not just international funding. And so we wanted to find out, okay, who is funding these researches? So a lot of the mentions were Europe, North America, but in terms of agencies, you will see that the NIH was the top funder, then Wellcome Trust. I'm sure Elisa will be smiling now, yeah. And but of course, other countries also fund a lot of research, like France. 9% of the publications mention France and Switzerland. So in a nutshell, I think what the data is telling us is that international funding significantly shapes Africa's neuroscience research environment. However, the availability of local funding in addition to international funding is critical to building a viable research culture. I think because I would like us to have a lot of enough time discussing during the panel discussion, also to answer some questions, I'll go straight to conclusions. So basically, in terms of this data, I think it is telling us that outputs and visibility of African neuroscience are on the rise, but for this trajectory to continue, domestic funding in addition to international funding is critical. And secondly, I think this is telling us that interventions for boosting neuroscience in the continent should reflect regional needs, since different regions are different stepping stones. And also, the data is telling us that in addition to the provision of training opportunities abroad, local and international neuroscience funding initiatives should support African scientists to establish their laboratories. And also, I think our data is also telling us that African labs have much more to gain from investing in infrastructure and expertise in designing and producing research-grade open hardware equipment, since these are affordable. And of course, our data also tells us that there's a clear need for increased investment to facilitate the use of affordable and genetically amenable model systems in African neuroscience. So this could be Drosophila, zebrafish, C. elegans, etc. And finally, I think our data clearly tells us that African scientists will gain considerably by increasing their local and international collaboration. But I think because the data is so huge, there are a lot of things that we haven't really analyzed. So if you have read our Nigerian neuroscience paper, then you read this paper, you see that in the Nigerian neuroscience paper, we actually went deeper to analyze a lot of different things. But in this paper, we haven't really done that. So the data is really available here. We would love to see people playing around with this data to see what they are able to come up with. So I will really end here by thanking the whole team, and of course also thanking the co-investigators, Tom and Lucia, who are also people that inspire me a lot. So Tom and Lucia founded Train in 2011, and I joined Train, and I think joining Train has really shaped some of the things that I've been thinking about in terms of African neuroscience. So thank you to them. And of course, these are people funding Tom, people funding Lucia. And in terms of myself, I'm currently funded through Louis Sappel by Alzheimer's Society, but I also hold some funding from Alzheimer's UK South Coast Network. And for the African neuroscience work that I've been doing, we've been funded by these different organizations or supported in some way. And I think Trend, we've been funded by ABRO and ISN. And I'm kind of affiliated to SciComm Nigeria as well. So I think I'll end here so that we can entertain questions, and we will also go into the panel discussion. So how this is going to work out is we would be starting the panel discussion, but whoever has question as well can send the question. If it is related to what I've spoken, I'll address that. But if it is something that I feel can also be addressed by the panelists, then I'll ask them to address it. So I think let me share my screen so that I can. Okay. Stop sharing. Fantastic. Okay. So I'm happy that Thomas Togo is here with us as well. So we thought you've escaped. So I think starting with the panel discussion, one thing that I would really love to find out is from the panelists, what are your thoughts about this data that on African neuroscience? Specifically, what aspect interests you the most? Since the first person that I can see on my screen is Relisa. I think I will start with you. What are your thoughts about this, and what aspects of the data interest you the most?
Great, thanks again for the lovely presentation and for inviting me today and pulling all of this data together. I think there's a lot of really valuable insights in there. I think it's really great to see the growth in publications, and I think especially it seems in the last 10 years, the 2010 to 2020, to me looked sort of, you know, a lot steeper rise than in the previous decade. So I think that's really, really great to see. I found that the distribution of the topics to me was very interesting, especially the fact that you mentioned, and I think from the figure, it's quite clear that it seems to be consistent across countries and across time. So some of the things, you know, like neurodegeneration coming through very strongly. One question that I had, and I wonder if maybe you've looked at the data in this way, I had a question about the relationship between volume of papers and citations. So thinking about whether there might be areas that, you know, a lot of papers are being published, but they're not having as much impact, or whether, you know, some of the lower volume of papers actually are having a lot of impact. So that interaction. So sorry to send the question back to you, but did you have any thoughts on that?
Yes, I think this is really an interesting question. But like I said, the data is huge. We haven't really gone into seeing which area is kind of having these citations that we are presented in the data. But I think this is something that would be quite interesting to do, and hopefully some other people would be interested in looking at that. Perhaps that would tell us more about the areas of strengths within the continent, as well as how we can convince people to invest in the neuroscience within the continent.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
So Pauline, do you want to say something about your thoughts?
I think John.
Yeah, hello. Thank you for inviting me to join this panel, and thanks for this wonderful presentation and for all the work that you, Tom, and Lucia have put into this, gathering all this data. I mean, from where I sit, data is king. So just being able to tease all that information out, and as you say, there's more insight to be gained out of the data. So it can only be a good thing. Personally, I found the link that you provided between research output, neuroscience research output, and sort of research and development spending by African countries, as well as the link with GDP, population corruption in terms of governance. I thought those were really interesting to tease out, to show that more or less you reap what you sow in terms of African government spending on not just neuroscience, but scientific research or research in general, that we need to put our focus right in terms of investing in research and development. So I thought that was really nice to pull out, as well as the geographic spread of publications. It was good to see the 5 regions in Africa and who is doing what in terms of the topics of neuroscience research. And it would be useful to know who those researchers are in terms of trying to encourage cross-Africa collaboration as well as international collaboration. Thanks.
Fantastic. I do agree with you. I think it's really good to show how those socioeconomic factors can influence the outputs. And hopefully we've got some journalists with us and perhaps even government officials. Hopefully this will help in, you know, it will raise some awareness and, you know, further discussion about it. Tom, what are your thoughts?
Right, yeah, thanks. Thanks, Mahmoud. I'm sure you know that I have 1,001 thoughts on this, but we'll keep it brief. First off, it's excellent stuff you've put together. I think I shared this with you when we had our initial conversation. And even making the data available on GitHub for other people to see what it can tease out, that's amazing. But for me, what I think was really key is that I think if you've been doing research in Africa, or at least trying to do research in Africa for long enough, the data you just presented is things that maybe intuitively we sort of had a sense about, but there was never any solid data to say that this is the reality of it. So getting this data is brilliant, because then everyone knows, okay, so these are clearly the facts. It's not just my gut feeling. It's not just how I perceive the situation. Take, for example, the data that shows that a lot of other African countries are collaborating with South Africa, whereas South Africa is collaborating with more countries sort of like in the global north. It makes sense. Everyone is trying to reach higher. right? South Africa has been so great. Why would they want to sort of like reach low, to come and collaborate? They want to aim a bit further. So, it's great to see the data supporting that. And it's great also to see the data about sort of like the research areas, so that everyone can know where the most amount of work is being done and areas that remain blank. And lastly, before you sort of open it up, it's about the techniques, that were available. I'm just there thinking, neuroscience, like one of the basics is calcium imaging, electrophysiology, right? If you're doing neuroscience, like those functionally mechanisms, you need those. And it's not listed anywhere in the techniques. So it really goes to show sort of the capacity building stuff that is needed. But yeah, this exciting stuff to see. I think this is a ground zero. This is where we start afresh from.
Yes, I kind of agree with you, because I think, a lot of the time when I have a conversation with people, they say, oh, you know what, this is happening, but we really lack that data. And I think this has been the real source of inspiration to go into conducting this study, because without real data, then you can't generalize things. But at least now we have the data there, so we can have real conversations about how to fix these things. So before going into the second question that I would like to ask the panelists, there's this question that came from Angela, and she said, it's kind of heartening to hear that African neuroscience is on the rise. But I wonder if we have our own African models that are being developed rather than using Western models. So I'll probably start by responding, and then I would love to hear your thoughts as well, Tom, being a neuroscientist working in the content. So personally, I feel that our work has looked at different neuroscience disciplines, but the area that is perhaps probably very exciting that we haven't gone deeper to look into is the clinical neuroscience discipline. And I think if we had done what Relisa has mentioned, which is that looking at which are the papers that are driving those citations, and also if we had looked deeply to look at in clinical neuroscience, what techniques are they using? Because the techniques that we analyze are based on basic neuroscience. We all know that we have clinical neuroscience. So if we had looked deeper into the clinical neuroscience, perhaps we would find more exciting stuff happening. But in terms of basic neuroscience, I would say that, of course, Africa should not be isolated. Neuroscience is a global problem, and most of the modules of neuroscience are used across the world. I would say that I don't think, as a basic neuroscientist, that we have our own models that we are using, which is not showing up here. And I don't think that we are really copying the Western models, but I think it's a global issue, and we are all trying to address this global issue in our own ways. But I would like to hear your thoughts on this, Thomas.
So just to get it right, the question was if we're developing our own models or just using the ones in the West. Is that right?
Yeah. So yeah, I think it's more about if we have our own African models that are being developed rather than using Western models.
Right. So I guess from what I am aware of in terms of the research being done, I would say no. And even as I say no, the other question I'll ask is, why do we even want to develop our own models, right? These models are available for most intents and purposes. You can cut across, you can use them anywhere and everywhere. So if there's a transgenic mouse model somewhere, why am I going to start from scratch to develop that when I can go get it? Because those things are not easy to develop. Even in the case where if we were to say we just have to copy established models that already exist in the West, even with that, look how we're struggling, right? It's not even happening. And to go and try and start from scratch is just not productive, I don't think.
Absolutely. Relisa, do you want to say something? Okay, then let's move on to the next question that I have for you guys. So this question is specifically to Relisa and Pauline, but of course, Tom, you can also add more details if you because of your involvement, of course, with IBRO, African Regional Committee, as well as other organizations. So from funders' perspective, how can this data help the direction of funding for African neuroscience research? So maybe let me start with Pauline now.
Thank you. I think I'll start by caveating that I can't speak for all funders in this case. This will be my personal view on how things stand. And so from my point of view, this is very useful data that you've pulled together, but I think it's just the start to convince funding to shift towards neuroscience. Just because a lot of funders are inundated by requests for investment. And so particularly if you're looking at those investing in research for development, then they often have a long priority list that they need to work through. And often they want to make sure that they are funding research that is really needed on the ground, research that will bring about change in people's lives, improve the health and wealth of people in low and middle income countries, have really impactful change on the ground. And so for me, it's about disseminating this data that you've gathered, this evidence, and making sure that all sorts of channels are aware of it and are advocating for more funding to go into neuroscience research. I mean, others are higher up on the list in terms of having created awareness about that space. And so it's difficult to come from a very low base to getting those huge pots of funding being allocated to neuroscience research at the onset. And so you want other voices on the continent, like African Academy of Sciences, WHO, NEPAD, Africa Union, you want them all to be blowing the same trumpet, to be saying that this is a key area where we are underfunded. And so having international partners working with us, and that's where Africans need to put their own money on the ground as well, in terms of providing some seed funding to enable more of this research to happen, or even matched funding. That's when international funders who are looking at development research would get more interested and know that they are addressing a need that is coming from the people themselves. And also doing things like making sure that there's a pathway for impact. A lot of organizations or international funders are looking at addressing the SDGs. I mean, the target is 2030. We're almost there. It's 10 years away now. How far have we gone? So relating your neuroscience priorities to how we can actually use that kind of research to address or to meet the SDGs is another way to go. And again, I would say there's a lot of focus now. I mean, there used to be a lot of focus on the TB, malaria, HIV. A lot of infectious diseases had a big part of the funding. Increasingly, it's becoming clear that in low and middle income countries, particularly in Africa, non-communicable diseases are on the rise very rapidly. So there's more interest in that, especially in mental health, in cancers, in obesity. So if there's a way to position neuroscience more as a multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary research area where you can start to tap into the existing funding that is available, especially for mental health research, or for other areas like biotechnology, biological science, synthetic biology, areas where there's already funding going, to start to glean some information and identify ways in which you can produce that concept notes, concept research, preliminary research, to then add more data to build a case for specialized funding allocation. I think that would really help to make the case. But definitely the data is useful for funders to see, but they need to hear this amplified, scaled up with the word coming in from various directions.
Fantastic. Ralisa, how about you? What are your thoughts?
I completely agree with Pauline. I think from my sort of, welcome sort of perspective, I think it is really, really striking how little neuroscience research is funded locally. So I think there's a lot to do in terms of raising the profile, trying to attract that local investment, both from governments and, philanthropy. And you and I have had that discussion that there are some, rich people around in Africa. They could maybe consider investing in neuroscience, and we just need to do a better job of making the case. And I think, again, Wellcome is certainly very interested in that sustainable research culture. So working with African neuroscientists to think about creative new ways to raise that profile, I think is very high on our agenda. I agree with Pauline. I think in terms of finding those areas of overlap and kind of cross-disciplinary, you know, multimorbidity, areas where neuroscience, you know, has a very close link to another discipline. So, you know, within our team at the moment, we're looking at, you know, neuroimmunology, and actually even within the UK, there isn't really, you know, it is something that is growing. So a lot of people are coming, you know, from different disciplines, and, you know, we're trying to sort of develop these approaches. But I guess it's, yeah, thinking creatively about how we can, you know, tap into these other pools of funding in areas where you might have a more established base. I think thinking a bit closer to home, I mean, I think it's very useful to have these data. I mean, both for us at Wellcome, we often, you know, advise applicants on their proposals. Our funding committees, obviously, you know, are making judgments about the suitability of research environments. They're thinking about, you know, how much mentorship is there, how suitable is this place when they're making their funding decisions. So I think it is very, you know, valuable to sort of have this data to contextualize, you know, this is the shape of the discipline. This, you know, is the pattern of how people are collaborating. I think that's really good to have. And I think going back to Tom's point, to actually have the data to back up people's intuitions, which, you know, to date, that's what they've been going on. So I think that's it from me. Yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you very much for sharing your thoughts. So let's go into the Q&A to probably answer one question before moving on. So there's this question still from Angela. I think it said, can I ask if African neuroscience will fit into the field of cultural neuroscience or another area or an area in its own right? If I understand this, this question is meant for me, but perhaps Tom will also address it. But if I understand this question, I do not think that African neuroscience kind of needs to be a field on its own right, or it needs to kind of fit into an area of cultural neuroscience or something. Because if you look at it, in our data, what we really found is that most of the publications are publications doing the normal neuroscience that you see across other continents, either basic neuroscience or clinical neuroscience, looking at diseases, reporting case studies in terms of clinical neuroscience. And in terms of basic neuroscience, we see kind of animal studies, you know, looking at maybe brain injury, etc. All these are classical neuroscience approaches and fit in within the neuroscience, basic and clinical neuroscience subdiscipline. But of course, you know, in terms of cultural neuroscience, perhaps we're talking about is some links with psychiatry or some links with public engagement with, you know, awareness about this neuroscience or something. Maybe this is what the person is talking about. But I do not think that African neuroscience has to be categorized on its own right as something entirely different from what we know about global neuroscience. But yeah, if you want to share some thoughts about this, any person wants to share some thoughts?
I can pick up on that. I think it's important that, especially from the African perspective, we try and show the cross-disciplinary nature of what we're doing, and especially to bring in sort of social sciences aspects of what we do, because a lot of health problems involve us engaging with patients and communities and actually making people aware of what the science means to them in terms of their own health and their own lives. And so if Africa can be the starting point for showing this kind of cultural neuroscience and how it links in with other areas of neuroscience, then why not? I think the more interconnected these various disciplines are, the better, rather than working in silos or following the existing model that is available in the West. So yeah, that's I think it would benefit all.
Fantastic. Thomas, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, and I think Pauline sort of touched on it, just to say that rather than maybe trying to look at categorizing it as something different, it should be about sort of like the research question that's being asked, right? So if you have an interesting research question which you realize that a behavioral or a cultural or a societal component really feeds into it, then yeah, you try and get the sort of like interdisciplinary collaboration going to execute that. But in as much as we are trying to promote neuroscience on the continent, you wouldn't necessarily want to carve it out as a niche all by itself. I mean, it's already small to begin with, so you don't want to make it smaller. If you create another smaller niche, then you know it becomes a bit more tricky. But I believe it should always be driven by the research question, and then whatever sort of like other fields you need to pull from or connect with to answer the research question, so be it.
Fantastic. Raliza, do you want to say something? Oh, okay, cool. Okay, so I think this kind of fits in quite nicely with this next question that I have for you, Tom. Because if you look at our work, obviously it has identified so many different things that would be important. And we raised this idea that local funding would be important for a viable neuroscience environment. So what are the ways you think we could use to inspire to engage policy as well as inspire policy change?
That's a heavy question, Mahmoud. I think for policy change, having hung around sort of like people who play around in the field for long enough, it becomes clear that it will always be driven by sort of like results. Okay, why would any policymaker want to put more funding into neuroscience? You need to show value. Whether it's that these results are going to be good for the country in the long run, or that is just going to project even them, the policymakers, and make them look good. So this goes back to why I said this is ground zero, right? Because then with this data, anybody who wants to make a case to policymakers has facts they can speak on, and then can clearly sort of start making projections and making comparisons and saying, hey, look, if we compare this GDP or this investment that this country made, you see how far they are going. You compare it to South Africa, you compare it to Brazil, you compare it to the other other countries in the global north, and you can clearly see what sort of input will result to a specific output. And I think that's the way to go. Really targeted, showing results that will benefit, or that the benefits of which will go beyond academia, and will go beyond just showing that, oh, we can do this sort of cool research in Africa and make these great results. No, what's the impact on the people, and what's the impact on the country as a whole?
Absolutely, absolutely, absolutely. So I think we will probably address two questions from the audience before we move on to the next question. I think there's this question that said, did your team look at any association between collaboration, citation, and use of traditional medicine in West Africa, seeing that other regions were not using traditional medicine as much as West Africa? So this is to me. So we haven't really looked at that. But the data is all out there, and we would be happy to hear what other people find, whether there's any relationship there. But clearly what our data shows us is that West Africa seems to be doing a lot of research using medicinal plants, so which kind of fits in with traditional medicine. So yeah, a lot can be done from that data. So there's this question which
Mama,
I think
can I just
step
in there? I just thought I'd mention that also a lot of the time, well, in my previous life, working across research in Africa, we find a lot of those kind of research into medicinal plants coming through under organic chemistry, where people are trying to tease out what compounds may be in locally used herbs and whatever, to try and identify those compounds, to think more about drug development. And so it would be worth seeing how the neuroscience research could link in with that to capture those people in Africa who are working in that space a bit more. Because at the moment it seems a bit fragmented, but there's a lot of research going on in that area, focusing on medicinal plants from Africa. Thanks.
Absolutely, absolutely. I completely agree with you. So hopefully this data set would help people going into dig deeper to find out any relationship. But of course, I think maybe this discussion will also raise more awareness into looking at how traditional medicine is being used across the different disciplines and how it is impacting the research and output there. There's this question from anonymous attendee. It says, how do you think research groups in the global north could do in order to increase visibility of African neuroscience? Thomas, why don't you go first?
All right. Okay. What could they do? I will start from the position and being careful to say it is that I don't feel is the responsibility of the global north to do something to increase visibility of African neuroscience. Platforms are being created everywhere. It's then forcing everyone to try and make the most of what's available. So if you consider and if you show value in yourself, just as let's say South Africans have shown value, so then the West Africans are going up over to the South Africans to collaborate. The global north has shown value, so then the South Africans are going to the global north to collaborate. If per your data, we are seeing clearly that there's a lot of this sort of like use of traditional herbs and so on, and Pauline just gave a great idea about how to hook up and better connect with a chemist and all of that. Once that starts giving value, you know, you don't need to plan it anymore, right? The global north is going to be like, hey, we need to find new compounds. We have a faster process of sort of like screening and identifying. Where can you get a lot of compounds we research into? West Africa, great. Then it's going to come full circle. So I think it rather falls on the research groups in Africa to start showing value. And as to how to do that, that's a whole different conversation, but yeah.
Okay, Pauline, go ahead.
I agree with Tom to an extent. We need to sell our capabilities to the Western world so they know who we are, what we're doing, and where to find us and how best to collaborate. But I think if they are willing to, people in the North can also continue to be creative about how they publicize the African neuroscience research that they are aware of, or once they become aware of it. For example, there are too many conferences that you go to and there's hardly any representation from certain parts of the world. Or when they've tried to do it, visa issues mean that people cannot travel over to be part of these panels, to be networking with others in the North and to showcase the research that they're doing. In a way, a blessing in disguise, COVID has leveled the playing field. We're all at home now doing the research from wherever we sit. And so I'm seeing more Africans being invited onto panels because they don't need to travel. And so I think in terms of the support that people in the North can give us, it's about helping to publicize that research by making sure that Africans are present in all these international events and programs and can have that platform to showcase what they're good at. Thanks.
Absolutely. Yeah, Relisa, please.
Yeah, just to add, I think I completely agree both with Pauline and Thomas. And just, recently there was a paper looking at the effect of gender on citations and how essentially female scientists are undercited. So even though we've had this massive increase in publications from women, they're not really being cited. And I think it's just, having this in people's mindsets of whether they're citing people in their work across a diverse spectrum. So are you citing every African neuroscientist, or are you just citing your immediate network? So I think it's, diversity more broadly, but just thinking again, that is something that would raise visibility if you're actually acknowledging that research exists and you're citing it in your own work.
Oh, and of course, capacity strengthening is always an area where people who have access to more expertise or more infrastructure can always help in. We have to be careful not to create a dependency in that African researchers will always expect handouts from somewhere else. We've got to be more creative in how we get those resources and convince our governments to invest more. But I think you always learn from someone, be it someone in Africa or someone outside of Africa. And if we share that knowledge, and of course, Northern institutions can learn from us as well in terms of how we use limited resources to achieve more. I mean, we are magicians in many cases. And so it's a two-way thing. So yeah, capacity strengthening is definitely an area where we can tap into expertise where we don't have it yet.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one thing that clearly our data suggests also is this issue of collaboration. So I think the Global North could help African neuroscience by increasing the networking and the collaboration happening between African neuroscientists and Global North. But of course, like you all agree, African neuroscientists have to do something to show up before that could happen. But I think that there's a lot happening. For example, if you look at the issue of genetic kind of diversity that is within Africa, there's a lot that can be done, and there are good neuroscientists doing fantastic work within Africa. So I think there is a potential situation of win-win situation where you want to investigate something about this diversity, or you want to investigate something that is endemic to Africa. So let's talk about, for example, cerebral malaria, meningitis, and all these different things that are happening. So a researcher from the global not interested in those things could look out for those scientists doing great work in this area. But instead of it being a relationship where they are leading, they could also help in allowing the African researcher lead, even if it is in the grant application, in terms of publication. All those things would help in raising more visibility. Yeah, so I feel, so because this panel discussion is supposed to end about 5:30, so we've got about 25 minutes. And now going forward, I think the questions that I would look out for would be those that are very, very relevant. But I would like to go back to the panel now. And I think this question is specifically to Relisa, because in our work, we identified the Wellcome Trust as one of the top funders for African neuroscience research. So my question is, are you kind of surprised? And how does Wellcome support African scientists in general?
Okay, so I think, Wellcome is the second biggest funder of biomedical research globally. So I'm not surprised, but I just want to draw attention again to the fact that it was still quite a small number of papers. So if I'm not mistaken, Mahmoud, I think it was about 24 papers that we were acknowledged as a funder. So still relatively small, and I think that's worth bearing in mind. And also I think because we're talking about 20 years, I think the mechanisms of Wellcome funding have changed a lot in that time. But maybe if I can just quickly go through at the moment, the way in which a neuroscientist from Africa could apply for Wellcome funding very briefly. So we have personal fellowships across career stages. So we have training fellowships for people who might have some initial experience or want support towards a PhD. We have our intermediate fellowships that are more around establishing your own lab. Once you have some postdoctoral experience, that's 5 years of funding covering salary and research expenses. And then we have our senior fellowships for more established folks. I guess one thing, and I think that might pick up on potentially a question that I saw coming through, is that the research should be based predominantly in Africa and also make a clear link to a health priority in that setting, which I think is, maybe trickier than some, infectious diseases or some of the disciplines that are better funded, but not, maybe not impossible. So Mahmoud, you had in your, first couple of slides talking about that the burden of neurological diseases is really big. So I think it's really just about making that case on how your research is relevant as a health priority in that setting. And again, all of these fellowships are available to people, whether they are basic neuroscientists or have clinical training. And I think Pauline might be aware a lot of these, I think, are funded with NIHR, so it might be able to say a bit more on that. We also have grants for people who might already have an established post, so they would cover just the research costs. That's our investigator award scheme. We also fund, and maybe this is of particular interest, we have a collaborative award scheme that looks to support teams working on problems that can only be solved through a team approach. So that can be, again, across the gamut, clinical or basic. But I guess the team thing is very relevant. And finally, we fund a small amount of research, I think, tied to our Africa and Asia programs. Again, they're largely focused on infectious diseases, but I think there are some elements that overlap. So there's a lot more information on our website. And what I really want to get across today is that we're always very happy to speak to prospective applicants about the fit of their project, their CVs, their plans on kind of timing of applications. So if anyone who's listening today is thinking of applying, please do get in touch with us. I think we are probably not seeing as many applications as we should in neuroscience. So just to encourage people, if they're considering Wellcome as a funder, have a look at our website, but do also, don't be shy about getting in touch with, your research ideas. We're always happy to have a conversation. So I think that's it from me. If there's anything kind of more specific I can break down, I'm happy to do that now as well.
Fantastic. I think one thing that I saw in the kind of questions, which is somehow relevant to funding, is that there's this kind of person, Ahmed Ladan, saying that maybe one of the things that would be useful is setting up neuro labs in strategic African countries, which will enable people to do research without necessarily having to go out of the continent, kind of enhancing this local collaboration. Yeah, I don't know what your thoughts are about that.
So I think if I understand the question, so I mean, all of this funding is available to people to apply for while still staying in their country. So none of them require travel. It's only if it sort of fits the project that you can spend some time abroad. You don't have to. I don't know if maybe do you understand the question differently? Was it thinking
absolutely, I understand. Absolutely.
Yeah, and I think another thing I just wanted to clarify that I think I picked up from the question. Wellcome is agnostic about research area in terms of, we don't have quotas, this much goes to infectious disease, this much goes to neuroscience. It's really, most of our schemes, people are applying across the breadth of biomedical science. And so really, I guess when you're thinking about applications, you're not just sort of, competing or trying to put across the originality of your idea relative to neuroscience, but it's really that added value in kind of biomedical science more broadly. And so at least, and that I think is probably different from other funders, but I just wanted to clarify that we don't have sort of specific quotas or pots for neuroscience. It's, as many good applications as we get, we try and fund. So you don't have to convince us that neuroscience is important. I think we believe that, certainly.
I do know that there are African Center of Excellence. Perhaps, Thomas, you would like, because IBRO has 2 African Center of Excellence, maybe this is something that the questionnaire can learn more about, and it can be a source of this collaborative network as well.
Yeah, so I was going to say so Raliza is right when she says welcome just fund anybody who showed them good science. So before I sort of talk about the neuroscience ones, here in Ghana we have a few centers of excellence, I think 3 or so. There's one in particular that the West African Center for Cell Biology of Infectious Pathogens, and they received huge funding from Wellcome. And what that has allowed them to do, at least in terms of cell biology research, what they set up is brilliant center. In the last year, when Tom and Lucia were here, and they commented about how pretty much the resources in the center made it look like it was anywhere in Europe. All right. Now this has then allowed sort of like people within that field to then go and do high quality research in the center. Okay. So in which case, it's very possible to do the same thing for something neuroscience wise. So I know there some of the centers that sort of like host the IBRO schools, the advanced neuroscience schools, UCT, a few in Egypt, and they have funding, they have the equipment which allows them to sort of do more capacity building locally. So at this point in time, what it then falls on is anyone who's doing neuroscience research in Africa, you need to start thinking, okay, what track record do I need to start showing? What team do I need to put together? Have a plan, a timeline in X number of years. I'm coming to Wellcome, I'm mentioning Raliza's name, and I'm asking them for $1 million. And let's get a center in my country. That's what we should be looking at. Yeah.
Fantastic, fantastic. Paul, did you want to add something?
Well, I guess what I would say is, it differs from funder to funder. So there are some funders who will have thematic calls where they specify what subject area they need applications in and for what amount of funding for how many years. But there are several other funders as well, or even sometimes the same funders have open calls where you have to convince them why they should invest in you, like Raliza was saying for Wellcome. And so it would be good, especially now that neuroscience is on the up. They are not really big yet, but you can tap into those kind of open calls to make a case for funding to expand neuroscience research. Yes, the World Bank provided funding for several African centers of excellence based on different themes, including the WACBIT one, there's some on agriculture and whatever. And again, this is based on the fact that information has got through to the highest level where the areas of need will be. So you'd hope that in the next 5 years maximum, neuroscience is on there as well, where there's a call for centers of excellence. And so as Tom was saying, you need a strategic plan in place and work towards that and identify your potential collaborators early, because many of these large funded projects need cross collaboration. They won't invest in one lab in one city in one African country. They want to see the impact that they can have in a region or at least across the continent. So that's where those South-South collaborations and North-South collaborations really come to play. You don't want to work in isolation if you want big grants to do big stuff in Africa.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I absolutely agree with you. I will answer two quick questions, then we then move on to the next question that I have for you, the panelists. So I think there's a question about whether human-induced stem cell models are used in these studies that we looked at. And I'll confirm that we haven't seen, there is nothing like that happening. There is nothing like human-induced stem cells used in these neuroscience publications. But then the person asks, are we using cell lines that are reflective of people of African heritage? I think this second question is super crucial. The fact that it has not been used in Africa should not deter us from using it in answering certain research questions, because we know that there is a huge genetic diversity in the African population. And I think a lot of the human-induced stem cells that are currently being used are mostly based on from Caucasians or those, global north. So nothing much is happening, I think, on African population that I'm aware of. But I do know that there is this startup in Nigeria. I can't really remember the name. Maybe Thomas will help me, but they are called, is it something gene, 54 gene, I think 54 gene. So they are trying to utilize, this, capitalize on this African diversity to see how they can produce, a data set, as well as, I think, materials or resources that people in other settings can use. So this is, and also History Africa probably is doing some work around that, but I'm not really completely sure. Pauline, you wanted to?
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in to say it's that area that we probably need to be careful that we don't run into barriers such as making sure we've got ethical regulations in place when we stray into that kind of research. I mean, other regions that have these cell lines and will also have the right regulations in place to make sure that ethically the research is sound. So that's an area where we need to look into for Africa.
Absolutely, absolutely, I agree. And so the next quick question that I'll answer is from our boss, Amadi, the Secretary General of the SONA. I think the question is about the funding and how we came to that. So, Prof, I'll tell you more about that if you want later on. But in a nutshell, I agree that I think in our data we will miss a lot of different funders. So we didn't really separate it into whether government or organizations, that's one. And secondly, we only looked at papers that got published in a journal above from 5 and above. So if we had looked at all papers, perhaps we would end up with a lot of other funders that are missing. But one key thing that I would still say is a lot of African neuroscience people don't really mention who fund their research. And I think funders should now make it absolutely mandatory for researchers that they have funded to mention this funding. So for example, I know that IBRO does fund a lot of work and activity in Africa. And so I would imagine that if IBRO funding has been mentioned, maybe we'll see that popping up. But yeah, so let me quickly go to the panelists now. So my question now is, based on the data that we've seen, there is a clear kind of disparity between the different regions. West Africa in terms of citation is doing really bad. And normally when you're talking about neuroscience in Africa, also South Africa is like the top. How can we reduce this disparity? Because obviously we want the whole continent to be carried along. Can we start with you, Raliza, then Tom, and then Pauline? Maybe you need to unmute yourself.
Yeah, unmuting myself. I guess one, very obvious low-hanging fruit is to try and think about what, South Africa and Egypt may be doing right. So thinking about increasing, the networks, the exchanges for both, PhD students, for postdocs, strengthening those networks between the two. But I was also thinking, you also don't want to stifle diversity, and we don't want to necessarily, emulate the ways of doing science. And, if there are other sort of areas of strength within Africa, we want to preserve a bit of that diversity there as well. And you might have different specializations, different strengths. So I think trying to understand, what's successful about those models, maybe how they've managed to, attract that, larger government funding. Some of that is useful, but with that sort of caveat that, we still want to value, different places for their different approaches. And, as you pointed out with the medicinal plants, the research traditions are still quite different. A second thought I had, and this is maybe one that, I'm sure Amadi might have some thoughts on this, and I'm sure you might as well, but thinking whether there's scope for SONA to be doing this type of analysis on a more regular basis, so looking at how outputs, citations are changing across time. If there are sort of emerging areas of strength, whether, there is scope to be nurturing them. So, picking up if you've got something emerging, can you bring a network together to kind of incubate that area to try, help them, shape their applications for further funding. So I guess it's thinking about that more holistic view of, neuroscience within Africa as a whole, but, I guess more directed rather than, organic and kind of bottom up, trying to think of, can you coordinate better and have that within the network? Whether maybe, SONA could play that role, but I guess keeping a closer eye on these data and being able to kind of jump in if something looks promising, it's emerging, trying to help those researchers along. I think something like that could help maybe the disparity long term sort of disappear.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think SONA would be happy to do that. Even yesterday, Prof. Amadi was talking about all these different initiatives. And I think for us as well, we'll continue monitoring this. We'd love to see what happens after 5 years, 10 years. Thomas.
Right, great. Thanks for that. And I think I was caught a bit in the same conundrum that Raliza was saying. And as she spoke, I managed to clear it up a little bit, being that you don't want to reinvent the wheel, right? So what is South Africa doing right? What is Egypt doing right? But then once you've figured out what this wheel is, and then you bring it to your space, then you realize, well, in my case, the diameter of the wheels needs to be larger than what South Africa has. Or, I need to make the wheel out of rubber instead of wood, right? But you don't need to start from scratch. So yeah, let's look at what these people are doing right. And the best way to do that is through these collaborations, and I see a lot of people, try to go spend a few months in the lab here, and, run a project there or so on. And then that really puts you in a place where you can figure out what they are doing right, understand it enough so that when you go back to your home institute, you can then contextualize it. And that will be a lot quicker than sort of starting from scratch. And then I guess the second point, which is great that you mentioned that Prof. Amadi was saying that SONA has some of these plans, is that, we need a game plan, right? So once again, I'll emphasize this work you've done has put us on ground zero. SONA is in a place they can just put together a game plan for us. And now every player on the field knows that, okay, I can fit here, I can fit there, I can do this. If not, it'll just be disjointed and all over the place. And 2 centuries later, we will still be here having this conversation because we never had a game plan.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, Pauline.
I think Tom and Raliza have already touched on important points. I guess what I would add is that we could also have a needs-based assessment across the continent. Your data has shown us where the different topics are sort of strongest across the 5 regions. Who is doing better in what area? If South Africa and Egypt are leading in certain areas, where are the other countries' strengths? And what do we need to make sure that as a continent, we're well equipped to tackle these neuroscience questions? So it's about identifying our strengths, identifying the needs, where the gaps are, and trying our best to connect across the continent. Where can we set up workshops where there'll be training, cross-continental training? How can we link up mentees and mentors so those who have that expertise can train the up and coming? Can we offer internships with the help of SONA, that kind of thing, where we're comfortable, where there's trust being built in these collaborations, where we know people are not coming to steal your ideas to go and do something, but it's about knowledge exchange and knowledge circulation and making sure that we're empowering our researchers to be the best they can be and to compete at international standards. So it's about echoing that benefit, that mutual benefit that all partners will get in terms of strengthening their areas of expertise. We don't all have to be doing the same thing, but preserve the strengths and train others to come up to our level.
Absolutely, absolutely. I'll quickly answer a question which was also sent by one of my boss, Professor Njuma. He said, do you have an idea why West Africa is lagging behind in terms of neuroscience research and collaboration? I think I do have some idea based on our data from Nigerian neuroscience, because West Africa is kind of dominated by Nigeria. And that data, when we looked closely, we saw that most of about, I think 25% of the papers from Nigerian neuroscience are published in African journals. And unfortunately, you know, of course, we are aware of some biases, but also we know that African journals have less visibility. So I do think that that contributes to the you know, visibility of research in West Africa, where the papers end up being published. But of course, there are a lot of other things that we can also talk about that might contribute to all these different things. Of course, collaboration might also be one of those things. Thomas, I would like to ask you, you know, so given this widespread lack of access to, you know, genetically modified models, etc., would you say that, you know, programs that promote the use of, let's say, zebrafish, Drosophila C. elegans, etc., would you say that things like that is what, you know, should be part of our priorities in terms of bridging this gap?
I would definitely say that, but then not just limiting it only to like the models you mentioned. So I know this is something that Trend is very key on. And last year, talking to Lucia and Tom, they were very keen to mention that, you know, the idea was to do these workshops and these trainings in the place where the people who benefit from it will be working and function, so that they can try and get these models up and running. So yeah, that's 100% what is really key, because without those tools, without those models, and I think I saw someone was asking a question about the sort of like in vivo and in vitro tools that are needed in neuroscience. Without that, you know, you can't really show the sort of data that moves the field forward. You know, there's only so much you can do with just Western blots before you need to shift to something else. There's only so much you can do with wild types after you've answered a few questions with it. You sort of need to, you know, start using genetic tools to then be able to investigate a little bit further. So having the capacity on the ground to do that work is vital. As at the moment, I know a few colleagues who, you know, they're taking advantage of some of these fellowships where they're starting a research program here, but then they go spend a few months or weeks in a lab somewhere in the UK to take advantage of their tools to just answer the next part of the question, you know. And you can imagine, like, I mean, that's just a long-winded approach. You need to move from home for X number of months to go and answer the next question, to come back and then answer the third question. How are we gonna move like that? So it's 100% like essential. Get that capacity on the ground, and let's see how it plays out.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think in the interest of time, we've got about 3 minutes left. So probably there's another question from Prof mentioning it should be good to reflect on the effect of publishing in predatory journals on the publications reviewed by Mahmoud. And I agree. And I think, you know, to some extent, PubMed does, I would say that most of the journals indexed in PubMed are clean. But of course, you know, we can talk about whether all of them are clean or not. So I would imagine that in our data, all the papers that we analyze did not fall into predatory publishing. But if we are to bring all these papers, probably those that have been published in predatory journals as well, I think we would end up with a lot of information that might be a little bit different from what we have now. So in the last 2 minutes that we have, unfortunately, I will have to apologize to all the different people that have sent questions, comments, and etc. Because of time, and of course, our panelists are busy, we would not be able to address them. But can I have like 1 minute each kind of final point from each panelist about what their thoughts are going forward? Let's start with Pauline.
Okay, it's been a very interesting panel discussion. And I guess what I would like to emphasize on before we close this, the importance of education in what we're trying to do. I think to really bring neuroscience to the fore, we need to see how we can fit that across the educational system to create more awareness and more visibility about neuroscience research and what it can do in terms of job opportunities. There's a wide range of things people can do, but also what curriculum is available. Are universities providing these courses and publicizing them? Are the teachers aware of this area of science? Because science in itself puts fear into a lot of people, although I find science fascinating. But how do we destigmatize science when we add the neuro to it? That would scare a lot of people. So it's how we get that educational piece across to journalists, to policymakers, practitioners, healthcare workers, just so there's more awareness and visibility of neuroscience research. Thanks.
Thank you, Raliza.
I think for me, it's going back to the visibility point. I think this is something really big that we all need to think very hard about. And we're very happy to have Mahmoud and a few other African neuroscientists help us think through the questions, try and think of creative new ways to raise the profile of the discipline. And I guess just to make a pitch, if anyone has really good ideas for what we can do, please let one of us know. That's it. We'd be very happy to hear from you.
Cool. Tom?
Raliza, thanks for that open invitation. We'll be coming to look for you. But yeah, I guess for the last 6 minutes, I want to share rather an observation. And I think once I share that, everyone else will be able to catch on. I was privileged to be at the FENS Virtual Forum over the last week, just gone. And listening to these presentations, world-class research work that's going on, it struck me that these presentations were work that was carried over a span of quite a number of years. And right at the end of it, when they start giving all the thank yous, you see these are large research teams, okay, PI and postdocs all over the place. Now, each of these postdocs is probably equivalent to like a PI that you have in Africa, right? Where we are rather running smaller labs. So really, to do the sort of research that is moving the world forward, it's not a one-man team, it's not a one-man lab. But if we find ourselves in countries where our labs are you and a few MPhil students, if you're lucky, you may get a research assistant, that's true. Then it means that the way to do this work, if you need high quality level people, will then have to be the collaborations, right? So if I am right now an early career researcher, I'm equivalent to a postdoc who was on a large paper that was presented, meaning I need to hook up with Mahmoud, hook up with another colleague here, hook up with another colleague there. And it's just through that collaboration, I think we will really be able to start proving the capacity and giving the results that needs to show the equality on the continent.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, thank you very much to all our panelists. This has been a very revealing panel discussion. You know, I've also learned a lot from it. And I think most of the questions that we were not able to ask, we were not able to address, you know, were addressed through the different discussions that we had. And one thing that I would like to say is that this data that we generated is out there, and we'd love to see people play around with it to take out some key messages that would further give an insight about how this neuroscience discipline can be improved in the continent. But at the end, I would like to thank the panelists on behalf of Professor Amadi, the SONA president, as well as all SONA members, for sparing your time to come and share your thoughts. And hopefully this will kind of continue the conversation both within and outside Africa, so that eventually in the next few years we'll look back and say, look, we've really done something, we've improved significantly from where we are 5 or 3 years ago. So thank you very much, and bye-bye for now.